Welcome to the Re-Quilibrium podcast. I'm Danielle LaCourte, and this is a conversation with Dr. Eileen McNeely, who is the founder and executive director of the Sustainability and Health Initiative for Netpositive Enterprise at Harvard, also known as Harvard Shine. Her research focuses on work as a platform for well-being in the business context, and I've always found this to be a fascinating framework for defining success in business because to me, it really expands past the usual discussions of productivity and performance to look at the whole person and how that whole person then shows up within the confines of the whole structures of their culture and society and organizations. I find this framework of work as a platform for well-being particularly pertinent as we continue to weather a global pandemic. So in this conversation, Eileen and I talk about what her group is finding about the impacts of COVID on workers. If you're into conversations like this, subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Additionally, I'm going to be turning many of these episodes into more journalistic written pieces and posting them on Medium. So you can follow me there as well as on other social media platforms like Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn at Danielle LaCourte. That's spelled LeCourt. And all of the show notes for this episode can be found on my website at daniellelacourte.com/podcast. And I've also uploaded all of the legacy episodes of this podcast to these platforms as well, if you'd like to get caught up on the topics that have been covered so far. And I have to say, it's been really fun to comb through these legacy episodes and really discover that while the technologies have changed and the way that we work has changed, a lot of the concepts in those conversations before are still relevant, if not maybe even more relevant than ever before. So now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Eileen McNeely. Eileen McNeely, it's so good to talk to you again. I know I get to see your face, but we don't get to be in person. I think we caught up about a few weeks ago, and the topic of discussion then was really about what the world looks like during COVID and after COVID. And, Harvard Shine doing the work that you do with well-being and workplace well-being specifically. I know you recently launched a survey just about how that's going within businesses, how workers are feeling throughout all of this. So I don't know if you could just go ahead and start and, just catch us up with how workers are feeling.
So, this is an unprecedented time. That word is so overused, but it's really different than anything in my lifetime anyway. And I'm pretty old. So what was interesting to us is we've always tried to focus more on this concept or construct of well-being, which includes not just physical well-being, but our emotional, mental well-being, our social well-being, our meaning and purpose in life, our happiness, life satisfaction, things like that. And it's always been difficult for people to focus on that because, it doesn't get paid for by insurance and that kind of thing. But now everybody gets it because in the face of challenge, that is the thing that we care a lot about, how our families are doing, how our employees are doing, how our communities are doing. So we used all our metrics on well-being and went to the community and asked people how they were doing across all aspects of their life. And so it was really interesting to understand really two things, what this really different time means across those dimensions. But secondly, how to put it in context, what people's lives are like. Do they have young children? Are they going to school? Do they have reserve finances? Are they essential workers? Are they retired? That changes a lot of things as well. So it's been interesting to understand things about inequities, things about security and things about well-being uh, with this lens of the pandemic.
A lot of our conversations throughout the years have really been dominated by this theme about, the relationship between work and well-being. And I remember in a previous conversation we had, we were really talking about this idea of well-being at work is either too big for employers, for companies to think about, or too restrictive. And often it leads leaders to not quite know how to show up in that way, and kind of the role that work is playing in our lives as a component of a full human life. And so I don't know if you can back up a little bit and talk to that point a little bit about, what is the role of work, and how does this really play into, you know and I joke that the term work life balance has always just completely annoyed me, because it's not like work is separate from life, right? And so can you speak to that, of what's the role that work is playing, and how is that being felt not only during the pandemic, but usually.
Danielle, I love your question, of course, because we're so focused on work as the platform for life. And, there's such a footprint that employers have, not just on their, carbon footprint or the things that we think about in sustainability and the environment, but on people. It's really expansive. And, as workers, we spend more of our waking hours at life than anywhere in our most productive time of our lifespan. So, besides employers having an impact in terms of how the work is structured and dignity at work and pay at work and all those things, from our standpoint, in terms of exposure, if something's good, it's really good because we get a lot of exposure, and something's bad, it's really bad. So looking at, work, there's so much that the pandemic has brought into view. And I can think of, we run this long-term study on flight attendants, for example, and they're essential workers. And that industry has been devastated, as we all know, as COVID has kind of shut down travel. And what was interesting is the difference between the approach from abroad and the US approach as to how to keep people afloat, financially secure, because that's one aspect of work that we take with us. And if things are shut down and demand is down, then job security is a big problem. And we know job security is very tied to health. So in Europe, for example, in the EU, the approach has been for governments to support companies to maintain a certain level of salary, like 70% or 80%, so that there is this continuity in benefits and just expectations and relationships between employers and employees. In the United States, we're handing out single checks, one-time checks here and there. And so it's absent of context, it's absence of relationships. Um, and so really the kind of commitment is very different. And that's a difference maybe in cultures and governments, but then there's also a difference in companies. And getting back to the airlines again, Southwest took a very different approach than other big carriers like United or American or Delta, that said, oh, we got layoffs pending. Everybody that we were surveying was very insecure about their employment and their financial well-being. Southwest said, we're not going to lay off. We're going to do what we have to. And management is going to lower their salary. And we're all going to share in the risk and reward. So we'll all go down to 80% or 70% if we have to. But we want to maintain the relationship with our employees. And that was huge. Now, everyone's skeptical. How long can they do that? But, so far, so good.
Well, and I think that brings up an interesting point too, and something that may kind of lead into. I want to talk a little bit about the survey results that you got also, but the long term impact of COVID, not only on our economy, but on our well being, on our ability to flourish as a species, and I think these are the big questions that many of your studies really are so expansive in how they encompass those things. Things like you mentioned dignity at work. I mean, how often do you even hear that brought up of, what does it look like to, feel a sense of dignity when you go to and pride when you go to work? And so I'm wondering, you see these different companies making different decisions, and obviously it's easy to speak about well-being at work, but when the rubber meets the road, a lot of times the conversation comes down to one of money. And so it's how are you seeing how are you seeing that balance? Places where they're able to float salaries or keep salaries at a particular percentage, for example. How is this working economically? And then what do you think the felt experience of that is, as well as the economic impact?
It's a really good question because people think, well, if the company is not financially viable, then everything else is off the table. But in fact, these things go hand in hand, and they've been more or less invisible or externalized costs. So, for example, calculating how much it costs to send or to lay someone off, there has been some recent papers on what that overall cost is once the economy picks up after COVID, because there's, 6 months in job search, rehiring, especially for knowledge workers. And so it's a very costly process. It's about a year and a half of salary. So it might seem like a good stopgap to lay someone off for a few months, but then you're dealing with a year and a half of salary in the rehiring and re-engagement and orientation phase. And so that becomes more into the picture of consideration. Um, I also think of, healthcare workers right now. We are doing some survey with healthcare providers, and for a long time, there's been this issue of burnout at work. And, they've been trying to deal with it because what we see is the number of providers available, they're leaving the profession. And so it's been on the horizon, it's been on the radar, but it has picked up because it's increased. The number of people leaving the profession has increased during COVID. So it brings up this idea that, to attract and retain talent is a very important thing that impacts the bottom line, never mind the workers. So we're starting to talk about, instead of burnout as kind of the negative harm of it all, is like, how do you create a compassionate culture, especially in jobs where people are, helping jobs, or caregiving jobs, and what does that mean, and does it really impact well-being and attraction and retention of talent?
Well, and this is where I've always thought the conversation gets really interesting, right? Because it's I think concepts like compassionate and having a compassionate culture, and what stress does for well-being. I mean, all these conversations tend to be ethereal and dismissed often as like, oh, well, what can we do? And I think that you're seeing, though, in these pockets, these case studies of when it goes really right and when it goes really wrong. And I think, and if you could speak to the survey you recently put out, I know there were some very anticipated negative experiences that were reported there in terms of stress, in terms of income, in terms of how people are feeling in their lives as a result of both the pandemic and their work situation. But there were a couple of key things that were little bright spots, and I think I can speak for a lot of people when I say we're like ready for some good news and some silver lining. I don't know if you can speak a little bit to what you found.
There were some bright spots, and I think it's actually really important to see them for what they are. And the bright spots, well, they two things big, and it has to do with the relationships at work. And it has to do with this perception on behalf of workers that management actually cares. And that increased dramatically during this time. And the other part is that my coworkers care too. And what we know from our own research, when we look at what we call caring cultures, and that's basically trust, respect, fairness, and caring on behalf of the people in the company. When employees feel that, they are less likely to leave, more likely to be satisfied in their jobs, and more productive in their performance at work. So we've been following that for a while, but what's also interested in getting back to the burnout example is that, you know, we're working now on how do you inject this idea of caring? How do you actually explicitly target that in the environment? And what does that mean? And what does it look like? And so there's been some work at University of Michigan about compassionate capability, and that is the ability for employees to be seen and heard and listened to, and for there to be some process to understand when people need help. So it kind of fortifies building teamwork and relationships. And how you start there is maybe start with some platform for expression. I think the the biggest anecdote I can give to people's sense of alienation at this time or feeling lack of compassion is their choice not to participate in these surveys, because what difference does it make? I say these things all the time and nothing ever changes. And if that isn't like a seed for burnout, I don't know what it is. But it's really something that, we do benefits for employees. We think about salaries. We think about maybe the nature of the work, but we don't intentionally target for a compassionate culture. And overall, it's very, very impactful. It was the number one thing before all those other things that I just explained that we work intentionally on in terms of predicting performance at work.
And how much do you think that, that sense of powerlessness or that sense of burnout really relates to powerlessness and feeling like eh, things are so much out of your control that you don't know what to do or you don't know what action to take?
So burnout is always thought of as, high levels of stress and overwhelmed by demands. But it also then becomes this depersonalization where people don't care anymore. And so even if they're in a job that requires that they care for others, they're not able to give of themselves anymore. And what we know about stress is it really is very strongly tied to a sense of control and autonomy. We know that from early experiments in the lab when we gave either subjects or even animals the ability to feed themselves, and it really motivated the behavior to continue to participate. And if you take things like that away and people feel like they don't have any control over their destiny, then not only do they feel stressed, but they stop participating.
Well, and I know too, another one of the findings in the survey had to do with learning and how much it seems like there's been an uptick in workplace learning since the pandemic, and I'm assuming it's for obvious reasons that we're all having to, respond very quickly to a situation that none of us have ever seen. But can you speak a little bit about learning and how that, plays into these concepts of a caring environment or burnout or powerlessness or stress or, what role does learning play?
Mm. So learning is like food and sleep. It's part of our human development and mastery in life. And so if we're not continually learning, then to develop and thrive. Seligman Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania has written a bunch about this. And so, so as Maslow, and in terms of getting mastery in your life and self-actualization. What's really interesting from the surveys that we did about COVID is initially I said, oh, wow, people are learning more. They feel like they're growing. And how could that be? We're working by ourselves, and there are some negative fallout for that. But, then I'm thinking about myself, like Zoom, I was never on before. and all of the technology and just all of the things you're taking care of independently, you have to figure it out and problem solve. But it's not just that. And the way I know this is just in our own team at Shine. And there was a couple of things that we discussed that became obvious to us as a group, as a research lab, is that people were struggling independently. Like, what do you do if you're on a Zoom meeting and your kids need help on their Zoom? And what do you do, if you can't, control the dog or the baby crying? And I give those examples because it happens to be that everyone in my lab is dealing with children in the house. And it wasn't just an individual struggle. People pulled together to problem solve and help each other learn how to cope. So my initial assumption, it was about the new resources and the technology, but I think it's much more expansive than that. And I think that our team felt really cared for in those discussions of collective problem solving. So it had a dual kind of influence, both on learning and growth, but also on that caring culture.
Well, and I'm so fascinated about where the concept of space and place comes into this,
Mhm.
right? Because, before when we didn't have such a turnout of people working remotely, I remember, even personally having been reprimanded at work telling me that my daughter coming in during a meeting was indefensible, was the word. And as a mother, it just crushes you to hear, the word indefensible next to anything having to do with your children. But the fact that we are in a very real way in each other's bedrooms now, in each other's
Yes.
kitchens, in each other's, whatever area, closets sometimes that I've
Mhm.
been loving some of these photos of, journalists that are reporting and then a picture of their space that they were reporting in and there's just like toys everywhere. And but I do think that goes back to this idea of dignity that you were talking about earlier of being able to finally see each other as human beings beyond coworkers. I mean, even by being in each other's space in this weird way that I think, years ago we wouldn't have anticipated.
I do think we have much more empathy for each other, and seeing each other personally, not just professionally, has really changed the nature of relationships. So that's an interesting thing. The other, I can give another example, is there's a policy at Harvard, that particularly, certain classes of employees have to be on site from 9 to 5. And there's been pressure, we're not as advanced as the European countries where maternity leave is 13 months or 12 months or something like that.
Mhm.
When I started at Harvard, I didn't have any maternity leave, and now you can get up to 4 months. But even at that, if you have to breastfeed for 2 years, I'll give you just the female version of this, but it's very difficult to kind of navigate that time and space. Space is important. There was no nursing rooms when I came to Harvard. I sound like a dinosaur, but it makes it so clear as to what place really means. But I wanted to just use this as an example because there was a lot of pressure on women to be present. And what this pandemic has shown us is you can be present without being there. So now we have to rethink how we do work in so many ways, and how much there do we need and how much will continue to be remote, is an interesting and outstanding question. One of the studies we did prior to the pandemic was on this new open office design, where people are in these open offices. So the intention would be that they would collaborate more, but there was this tension between collaboration and auditory and visual privacy
Mhm.
that then was kind of taken away. So you found people with headphones on, or people trying to go remote at least one day to actually get work done. So it had this mixed thing. Now the thought is that if, as work changes after the pandemic, that there probably will be more acceptance of remote work, which is good for parents, for example. But on the other hand, the people in the office will have to navigate some new territory. That means that there'll be these hybrid models. There'll be a lot of Zoom meetings in the office. And if we thought that auditory and visual privacy was a problem before, we have to address this. So I
Mhm.
think of this as an opportunity to innovate what we do and how we do it.
Yeah, well, and I know even, a couple years ago when we were talking about all these things, um, there was kind of this catch 22 even with working virtually, and because that was being used often as an incentive of having a day from home, or and especially in the gig economy, when you had contractors that would kind of pop in and out, and then employees would see that, well, the contractors are doing this and I have to be here all day, and so they'd incentivize it, and we were kind of wondering, is that a good thing? Is
Mhm.
that actually going to um hinder or help
Yes.
the relationships at work? And I think now we are absolutely forced to figure out that question, and what
Yes.
that actually is going to look like, in terms of social well-being as well, and team cohesion, and the social aspect of it, because I think that is very acute in people's experiences right now.
I love that you brought up this social aspect because as we talk about all these silver linings, the one thing that we do know is that the amount of screen time that we have alone is going up, exponentially as we are remote. And there are good and bad of that, and we have to figure out the net of it so that yes, we can access a lot more people. We can be more efficient because we're not going to sit in a meeting and for 2 hours. So the meetings from the data are that they're shorter, but there's more people on per meeting. So what that means from a kind of stimulation point of view, we're very programmed to read nonverbal cues. So now we're not looking at 8 people around the table. We might be looking at 24 and trying to take in all that information. It's a lot on our adrenal system, whether we recognize it or not.
Mhm.
And so if you're tired at the end of the day, you're tired because even though maybe your time in meetings is less, but the effort, the overall effort that you put in per meeting is more. And the other thing that we find is that the workday has expanded because you have to get off and get on the Zoom call with your kids' teachers and get them set up. And so people are, I think, people are committed to finishing their work, but it might mean that it takes 12 hours instead of 8 hours. So the workday is expanding and then really bridging over between meal times and after meal times. And so this again is the overall demand stressor. So we have to think about that. And I like that we're consciously putting up on the kind of things to measure, things to consider is how this impacts our workload, how it impacts our social relationships, and how it impacts our overall well being.
Right. Well, and I suspect also that we're developing new social skills because of this new way of communicating. I did I mentor a group of undergrads, and we had a meeting this last weekend, and just as a kind of mindfulness exercise and just total social experiment, um my my instructions were to pick somebody on screen and just be with them. Just think about what you know about them, and just bring them into your mind. And it was interesting because even as I was describing it, I qualified it like, this might be super awkward, because in person that would be really awkward to just stare at somebody and be with them quietly. Um, but at the end of it, everyone was like, that actually wasn't awkward at all, because I had no idea if they were looking at me back. And even things like eye contact and these normal social cues, like you were saying, are completely changing. And I think we're all going to develop new ways of communicating that we can't even foresee at this point.
I love that you brought this up because there's been this chatter in the culture about, when I grew up, for example, if you needed something, you picked up the phone and talked to a human being. And that rarely happens anymore. And especially the students, that I teach, they rarely talk on the phone. Everything is text or email. And so the concern in kind of the broader kind of cultural norms is, what does this mean for ability to perceive the emotional tone of a conversation, because there's no auditory, no verbal cues. And so now that we're back on Zoom, is this might be a good thing, because we can interpret a little bit more and become more emotionally intelligent. That term that we're now paying attention to as even more important than overall IQ. It's our ability to read people's emotions is very important in how we conduct our behavior and our success in life.
Well, and I think, to kind of zoom out a little bit and talking about, these kind of mega trends that have been slowly shifting work and well-being as a couple, in different directions, things like globalization, for example, or the gig economy or automation, these kind of mass things that are happening. It's interesting to take that component of it and like globalization, for example, and you look at how globalization has made the world a lot smaller, and then put COVID on top of that and think of how much it's even more condensed our worlds to where a couple hours earlier was on a meeting with somebody in Switzerland, and that's a normal thing now to where you can speak to people all over the world in this new format that I think was being adopted, but not en masse and not as quickly as it has been shifted in the wake of the pandemic. And I think, it's kind of like everything that it's going to probably end up being, a double-edged sword and how it works and how and what that means moving forward. But I'm interested about your take on that of like these mega trends and how COVID is kind of either accelerated them or changed them.
I love the question, because in sustainability, we've always been trying to get uh, a focus on kind of the global impacts of any one company, one worker, one operation. Uh, pretty much we take in data at the point of wherever we're in contact. And I'll talk a little bit about apparel supply chains, because we do a lot in supply chains in developing world, where we've moved a lot of the production offshore. And so we've always been trying to connect the dots between parent companies or brands that are purchasing supplies through vendors across the world, and make the connection between what you do, how they act, and the impact on the factory floor. And it's always, it's always overlaying these diagrams, but it's really hard to see the system. And when the system isn't local and it's global in particular.
Mhm.
So what's been really helpful about COVID is bringing into sharp view that what I do impacts what you do. And so, for example, in apparel, when the stores closed down, there was lower demand. And so, brands, depending on their ethical practices and kind of financial situation, either stopped the orders, even though the orders were in process, or did not pay for the orders that were already produced. And what happened is then workers were laid off, suppliers went out of business, and now, as business is picking up, some of those suppliers are gone. So it's the same idea as what we were talking about, just laying people off. And then now realizing I got to spend a year and a half getting back up to the costs and the production from hiring someone to replace them. It's the same sense here, except it's at the organizational level. But what's very clear now is, how do you instead of just, preserving your kind of center of gravity or operations, how do you think about your spillover and the ripple effects across the globe? It's made it really apparent of the costs and the opportunities to have a different kind of relationship. So I do think, as a kind of a global trend from this, the things that we've been very, very much trying to connect the dots on are so much more apparent.
I mean, it might be hard to say, but how is this going to look in the future because of this?
So one of the to get to a very specific example again with the apparel industry, it used to be that you had a diffuse supply chain so that if there was, a kind of a natural disaster or a political event, that you can quickly move operations and so that you would not be vulnerable in terms of the risk. Right now it's the thinking is shifting a little bit that in fact you you should not be the only one that is considered in risk mitigation. It needs to be a cooperative supplier buyer relationship with a shared risk and shared reward. Um, what that means is that instead of having a very diffuse supply chain, they're consolidating to important suppliers and then thinking about how do you share risk, reward, innovation, investment, sustainability goals. How do you make those things a partnership? And I think that that's changing.
How does that work in a gig economy context? I mean, how do people think about this as, I am a contractor, I'm a freelancer for a living, and I know many people also who do the same thing. And so as you're talking about these things about shared risk and concepts like that, how can we think about that at our own levels on a micro level or on a leadership level, just at all levels of this ecosystem?
So I think for gig workers, this is a really key point that we haven't really figured out because just as we, took a lot of industries and we put the production offshore, it was so that we could mitigate our risk of, a change in demand or a change in climate in some way. The gig economy has been built in that same way. And what is not totally apparent to all of the stakeholders is what is the cost of a economy
Mm.
in terms of real knowledge creation, in terms of health and security, in terms of productivity. Uh, we don't know because effectively, when you create a gig economy, you buy things in pieces. And so, or you buy a certain function for a short period of time. So, here's the problem of connecting the dots. Overall, is it costing you more? Is it more efficient, less efficient? And I don't think we have the answer to that because also the answer changes by industry.
Yeah, well, especially in knowledge work as well, like you mentioned before, and knowledge workers in the gig economy. It's a very different product that's getting pulled through a supply chain basically than is apparel or food or things like that.
Or Uber drivers or there's probably every industry has their gig workers. And so healthcare, we have a huge temporary workforce. Um, but what does that relationship and employment mean overall? What is gained and what is lost?
Yeah, higher education too,
Mm.
colleges and
Yes,
adjuncts and yep.
yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect example.
And this is where kind of to try to steer it back to some of the silver linings, I've seen a recent push. I thought this was a really creative idea, but for example, there was an entire department in a global company that is one of my clients that um, basically they're administrative workers whose full-time job it used to be to coordinate travel. They found themselves with nothing to do, and rather than um, lay off this department of people, they have sought to retrain them in different skills. So I'm doing conducting a communications training with admins to basically retrain them in a different skill set. And it seems to me like that is kind of also a win-win situation in that, it's a win for the organization and that they have areas where they're overworked and need help and they can retrain that way. And it works for the individual in that if worst case does happen and layoffs do happen, they at least have a new skill set that they could potentially re-enter into the gig economy if they need to. So
Mhm.
I thought that was a really innovative idea of, let's there's all of these things that we're hiring contractors for, but
Mm.
instead maybe let's just train our people to see if we can get them to a level where they can do it, and that's a new way forward.
Well, it also is a caring thing to do when we talked about learning is like sleep and food and water that we need it for our thriving. So at a very basic level, that's a good thing to do. I'm reminded of the maker of Swiss Army knife. After 9/11, their business crashed because no one could take their pocket knives. Always people used to
Mm,
always have a pocket knife
mhm,
in their pants, and their business was devastated. But what the parent company did is they said, for us, one of our main sources of success is our employees. And so they chose not to lay them off. And what they did is they gave them all the skill building, and they created like a new company, and the company was to contract out the work of their workers, but they chose not to send them off. They chose to maintain the relationship, and so it really put, I think, the greatest emphasis on relationship.
mm,
So yes, they trained him, but they trained him and kept them as part of the business, not even just to, kind of see different skills within the organization, but it became a very proud or prideful part of the business because these workers were so uh, thankful to their employer for not only training them, but for creating a new successful business.
mm.
And it was a win-win for everybody.
Well, and if I can use the point of relationship to segue a little bit into the not so elephant in the room about, we're living at a time, at least in the United States, where relationships are really suffering, and relationships between businesses and people, and family relationships, intimate relationships, friendships. Um, how how do you see work? Um, how could work be utilized as a source of healing of this? I think so many of us are scared, and just watching what is happening and watching people get torn apart by the media, by you know it, by the way we search out information and get different things. I mean, what is there to focus on within those relationships that might help?
You know, what you're bringing up is something that very progressive companies are starting to think about. And, usually we had kind of emotional support in terms of, coaching people in, with their jobs and how to get things done. And then there was a different thing that companies did, and like employee assistance program, which is to help employees who have individual problems or family problems, and they go and they get individual help. And now companies are saying, wow, this is a really emotional time. And we see violence, we see protests, we see people fearful, distrusting. And so it's got to influence all of us. We see it on the news. Right now, we're in a time where tomorrow's the inauguration. There's 25,000 National Guard in Washington, D.C., helicopters flying all over the mall. um, People are scared.
Mhm.
And so the progressive companies are saying, we have to, if you're going to be a compassionate company, you have to listen and let people be heard and recognized. And so people are going through losing a loved one to COVID and not be able to mourn or grieve. They have a friend. They are fearful of getting COVID, as some recent surveys have shown. It's a worry that is on people's mind, and they don't have the ability to go see their family or friends and get that support. So workplaces become a forum for that. And so companies are starting to have those conversations about how you're doing. When we did our study on a community sample, it was in May. So it was just a few months after things started. And at that time, 25% is actually in June of 2020. 25% of people were saying that either they had COVID or close friends and family had COVID. It's more than that now.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you're talking about the prevalence of this worry and fear and distrust. And so it's very distracting. We also learned, people feel like they can't concentrate. They're very distracted at work. So one way to handle this is to become, you know, uh, a forum to discuss these things that people are experiencing so that they know they're not alone, and they might be able to collectively problem solve on how to grieve, for example.
Well, and I think bringing work back to into focus as a prominent player in the way forward, because and this kind of points back to previous conversations that you and I have had, but actually getting workplaces to own their role in society and how much they fold into the fabric of society. And you see a lot of the innovations that come start in industry and they start in workplaces. And it might be one of the only places we have left where we're around people different than us,
Hmm.
who think differently, who have different belief systems, whether it's religious background or just ethical beliefs, personal beliefs,
Hmm.
different family structures. I think it's one of the last vestiges of that kind of setup in society. And I think the opportunity there is really high for those people who are willing to take up that mantle.
What you're saying resonates with another study that we had done looking at, you know, with work. Do you find that people who are at a higher state of well-being or thriving in their lives do better at work, or do they get those things at work that help them thrive in their life?
Mhm.
So what comes first? It's a chicken and egg problem, but we had the opportunity to look at a longitudinal sample. In other words, how people do over time so that we can tease out which came first. And what's really interesting is you get a lot of things from, people's personal lives in terms of their overall thriving in life. But what you get from work more than in life, and this was surprising to us, is even though you get social connection in your community and your family and stuff, you get your social network predominantly at work.
Mm.
And you never think about that. And when we think about the power of work to change our lives as a civil society with the network already in place, that is really amazing. And companies have started these kind of Friday Zooms to just like talk about what people are doing so that they can just maintain that network. But not just to get through COVID. How can we use that going forward to promote a civil society? Because, as you said, it's a place of diversity. You pick your friends, but you don't necessarily pick your coworkers. And for that reason, you learn how to negotiate things in people's different styles, and you learn how to respect diversity and inclusion and those things.
Yeah, well, I mean, work is really one of our biggest touch points to society. It's one of the biggest ways in which we interact. And like you said, when we pick our friends, we even pick our information now. We're not even on the same page in terms of the information everybody's getting about everything. And so that seems to be the one of the last places where we can get that.
Mhm. It's funny. I have friends who will say, it's very hard to talk to my family about politics or this and that because, there's this kind of very polarity, I think, in society. But they can talk to their coworkers about it because you can, it's respect that, you have to give as part of the work setting, and it's the conditions of employment. So
Hmm.
it really does change the rules in a very good way.
Well, yeah, it's one of the last places also where there's incentivized civility in that
Yes.
you have to.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Eileen, I know we've taken some time now, and this is my first episode back with this podcast, and I was so excited to kick it off with you. And I I have always appreciated the work that you do with Harvard Shine, the work the group does, as well as this concept and this thought that that work is something that we is a place where we should also be considering things like compassion and caring. um so if I were to conclude with just one question, it would be, um what are you looking forward to a year from now? What are you looking forward to seeing unfold, or what gives you hope moving forward in what is a pretty difficult time for most of us?
What gives me hope is some of the things that we had talked about is that people see each other now, whether it's because they have a bedroom and you do too, and I've seen it on Zoom,
Hmm.
but there's much more empathy in that way, at least in our work groups, which now we know is a very strong source of social connection. What I imagine we're going to have to pivot to after this is that we've been in crisis mode. We've been in the kind of lockdown, and then return to work and make work sanitary and safe, and office density okay, and schedules so that not everyone's there, and but now we have to think about work all over again. Like, how do we do it? And how much remote work is good? And what about this hybrid model of the Zooms in the office with open office space? And how do we come together in a respectful way? um, I think that, we might learn how to collaborate differently, and then try it's actually the motivation to try something new, and then see how it goes, evaluate it, and then scale it. So I see the next part in the future, in the next year, is we're going to start to model different innovations about how we do work. And it's going to be from there that we are going to be able to, maybe change in forever the way that we do work. And I hope it's with a mindset to understand the kind of invisible aspects of work now, and to connect the dots across the globe.
Well, I know y'all will be keeping an eye on that, and I hope you'll come back and talk when we do have some findings about that, and as we see this play out, after this inauguration, after the pandemic. Granted that it ends, but yeah, can't wait to catch up with you in the future and talk about these things again.
Danielle, thank you. And thank you for talking about something that's important for all of us, not just something near and dear to my heart. It's really important that we have these conversations. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eileen.
Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.